Today was my daughter-in-law's birthday. I walked into her boutique with a bouquet of sunflowers, and the moment I stepped through the door, I heard a voice screaming, "How dare a filthy little nothing like you touch my designs?" Through the gap in the glass, I saw her on her knees, sobbing. When I looked at the woman screaming at her, my blood ran cold. That woman was my wife. Before I tell you what happened next, let me tell you what I found in a box of papers days later. I appreciate you choosing to spend this time with me. One small thing before we start. Drop a comment and let me know. Have you ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they weren't who you thought? Yes or no? I'd love to hear your answer. Some details in this story are fictionalized for narrative and reflection. The message, at its core, is what truly matters. It was my daughter-in-law's birthday, and I was carrying sunflowers when I heard someone call her a filthy little rat. The voice came through the frosted glass of the boutique workroom, muffled just enough to strip away the face behind it, but sharp enough to carry every syllable of contempt. I stood on the Georgetown sidewalk, with the bouquet in one hand and the door handle in the other, and I did not move. "How dare a broke little nobody like you touch my fabrics?" Through the rippled glass, I could see two silhouettes. One was standing with her arms crossed, tall and rigid. The other was on her knees, gathering something from the floor. Fabric samples, I realized, scattered like playing cards after a tantrum. Look at yourself, on your knees. That's exactly where someone like you belongs. The woman on the floor was Celeste. I knew her shape the way you know family. The narrow shoulders, the careful hands. Celeste Ashford, 27 years old. The young designer who had built this Georgetown boutique from a single sewing machine and a lease she could barely afford. My son Garrison's wife. And someone was standing over her like she was nothing. But let me start from the beginning, because the morning matters. 3 hours earlier, I had been standing on King Street in Old Town Alexandria, buying sunflowers from the same sidewalk vendor I'd visited every June for the past 12 years. The tradition started with Helen, my first wife, who planted them along our back fence the year we bought the house. She died of pancreatic cancer 11 years ago. The sunflowers stayed. You need to understand what those sunflowers meant before you can understand what happened next. They were not just flowers. They were a promise I made to a dying woman, that I would keep showing up for the people she loved, even after she could not. I was 69 years old that morning. Retired. I had spent 41 years building a maritime freight company that moved cargo across 3 oceans, and I had sold it for enough money to make the rest of my life very comfortable and very quiet. I wore a faded olive field jacket that morning, instead of any of the suits in my closet. Because some days call for the version of yourself that existed before the money. Boyd Harrington, my chief of staff, 47, former Marine intelligence analyst, met me at the car with a raised eyebrow aimed at the jacket. Boy had worked for me for 9 years and communicated primarily through eyebrows and silence. "You have 3 Brioni suits in your closet, sir." "I'm aware." Boyd, just noting the contrast. Some days call for the man who existed before the money. He opened the passenger door without another word. We drove from Alexandria into Georgetown with the flowers on the back seat, and the morning smelled like river water and fresh-cut stems. And the coffee I'd brought from the house was still warm. And for approximately 43 more minutes, I believed my life was simple. I parked 2 blocks from the boutique because Celeste always said I drove a car that embarrassed her customers. I signed the visitor log at the building's front desk. I took the elevator to the 2nd floor. I walked down the hallway with the flowers in my left hand and the bitter end of my coffee in my right. And that is when I heard it. The voice behind the glass was not a stranger's. It was a voice I heard every morning over coffee. I stopped walking. The hallway was empty. The frosted glass workroom door was closed but not latched, and through the narrow gap at the hinge side I could see a sliver of the room, the cutting table. The dress forms. The rack of sample gowns Celeste had been finishing for a client showcase. And the woman. She was standing with her back half turned, one hand resting on the cutting table as if she owned the surface beneath her fingers. Cream blazer, hair pinned in the style she wore to charity luncheons. The posture I had watched across 1,000 dinner tables. I'm going to suggest, gently, that perhaps this little shop of yours isn't the right fit for someone without real talent. Celeste did not answer. She stayed on the floor, her hands full of scattered fabric, her shoulders drawn in like she was trying to become smaller. The sunflowers in my hand suddenly felt like they weighed 40 pounds. I leaned into the gap in the doorframe and saw the woman's face full on. My blood did not boil. It turned to something colder and more permanent than anger. Because the woman standing over my daughter-in-law, on her birthday, calling her worthless in her own shop, was Lorraine, my wife. I didn't move. I stood in that hallway with flowers in one hand and my whole marriage crumbling in the other. And I watched my wife deliver the real blow. I'm going to pull every dollar I put into this place unless you learn what gratitude looks like, Lorraine said. Her voice had settled into something worse than shouting a calm. Surgical cruelty that told me she had practiced this. She was not angry. She was performing. Then the workroom door shifted, and someone else stepped into view. Priscilla Vance, 29. Lorraine's daughter from her first marriage, leaned against the doorframe with her arms crossed. She worked in pharmaceutical sales and dressed like she wanted everyone to know it. Silk blouse, gold watch, nails filed to points. She looked at Celeste the way a cat looks at something it has already decided to kill. Mom, she's so slow, Priscilla said, examining her cuticles. They really will let anyone open a shop these days. Celeste had restacked the fabric samples, every swatch back in order, organized by weight and weave, the way she always kept them. Her hands were steady now. She did not look up. Priscilla reached down and swept the entire stack off the table again. The samples fanned across the tile like a deck of cards thrown at a wall. Oops! 2 staffers stood near the pressing station. Neither moved. Neither spoke. They stared at the floor with the practiced stillness of people who had learned that silence was the price of keeping their jobs. I have built a shipping empire and negotiated across 3 continents without flinching. I have sat across from Port Authority officials in Lagos who carried weapons to contract meetings. None of it prepared me for standing 8 feet from my wife while she destroyed someone I loved. My hand tightened on the doorframe. The frayed cuff of my field jacket caught on a screwhead. I could feel the cold glass under my fingertips and the heat climbing up the back of my neck. And every instinct I had was telling me to push that door open and end this. But I didn't. Because the moment I walked in, Lorraine would know I had seen her. She would adjust. She would explain. She would find the angle that made this look like concern, like tough love, like a mother-in-law helping a young woman who needed guidance. I had watched her reshape reality at dinner parties for 7 years. She was better at it than anyone I had ever met. So I stayed in the hallway and I watched. Lorraine straightened her blazer, said something too low for me to hear, and walked toward the door. Priscilla followed. They passed within 4 feet of the alcove where I stood pressed against the wall, close enough that I could smell Lorraine's perfume, the jasmine one I had bought her for Christmas. They turned the corner. Their heels clicked down the corridor and faded into the elevator chime. They never saw me. I looked back through the gap in the door. Celeste was alone now. She was on her knees again, picking up the scattered fabric for the second time. No one helped her. The 2 staffers had retreated to the back room. The workroom was silent except for the soft sound of cotton and silk being gathered off cold tile. Something in my chest did not tear. It did not crack or break the way grief does. It crystallized a decision forming in the space where shock had been, harder and colder than anything I had felt since Helen died. I walked back down the hallway. I took the elevator to the ground floor. I crossed the lobby and stepped out onto the Georgetown sidewalk, where the air smelled like fresh bread from the bakery next door and car exhaust and summer, and none of it reached me. I set the sunflowers against the boutique's front step. I could not go inside. If Celeste saw my face, she would know something was wrong. And I could not explain what I had just witnessed without also explaining what I was about to do. I did not yet know what I was about to do. I only knew it would be thorough. 2 blocks to the car. I sat behind the wheel and called Boyd. "Pull everything on Lorraine's connection to this boutique," I said. "Financial records, investor agreements, communications, and find out how long she has known." Not when she found out how long she has known and said nothing. Boyd was quiet for 3 seconds. That was a long silence from a man who measured words like ammunition. Understood. Timeline? Today. I ended the call and sat in the car with the engine off. She chose today. She chose the birthday. This was not a woman losing her temper. This was a woman who had picked the day that would hurt most and brought her daughter along to watch. By the time I reached Alexandria, Boyd was already at the kitchen table with 3 legal pads and a look that told me he had found something. Boyd had 3 legal pads filled before I had even hung up my jacket. He sat at my kitchen table with bank statements fanned across the mahogany like evidence at a crime scene, and the look on his face told me that whatever he had found in those 3 hours was worse than what I had witnessed through the frosted glass. "Start from the beginning," I said. Boyd uncapped his pen and tapped the first legal pad. 3 weeks ago, Lorraine had lunch at the Watergate Hotel with a woman named Ramona Blackwell. Charged it to the household Amex, $240, including wine. Ramona Blackwell is the angel investor behind Celeste's boutique. She put in the seed money 18 months ago. I pulled out a chair and sat down. The afternoon light was coming through the study windows at an angle that made every line of Boyd's handwriting look like it had been etched into the paper. 2 days after that lunch, Boyd continued. Lorraine visited the boutique, signed the guest log at the building's front desk. I pulled a copy. She spent 45 minutes there. Never mentioned it to you. Never mentioned it to Garrison. And from what I can tell, she never mentioned it to Celeste either. She was scouting. She was setting the stage, sir. This morning wasn't an impulse. It was the performance. I sat with that for a moment. My wife had spent 3 weeks preparing to humiliate my daughter-in-law on her birthday, and she had done it with the calm, methodical precision of someone who had planned worse things before. I had negotiated billion-dollar freight contracts across 3 continents. I had read men who lied for a living and walked away from tables where the numbers didn't add up. And I had missed this. I had missed it because the woman doing it slept in my bed and poured my coffee and asked about my day with a warmth that now, in this light, looked nothing like love and everything like surveillance. "There's more," Boyd said. He slid a stack of printed bank statements across the table. They were from our joint household accounts, the operating account, the reserve account, the money market I used for quarterly taxes. Each page had entries highlighted in yellow. Small transfers, 2,000 here, 4,800 there. Never more than 9,000 at a time. I started pulling statements going back 2 years, Boyd said. At first it looked like normal spending household expenses, credit card payments, charitable donations. But when I isolated the outgoing transfers to a single destination account, the pattern became clear. He turned to the second legal pad, where he had listed every transfer in chronological order. The column ran for 3 pages. 147 individual transfers over 24 months. Each one structured just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic review from the bank. "How much?" Boyd set his pen down. He did not look at the pad. He had memorized the number. $1,250,000. The room went very quiet. I could hear the Potomac wind pressing against the window glass and the distant sound of a boat horn on the river. The coffee on the desk had gone cold hours ago, and the bitterness of the last sip I had taken was still sitting on my tongue like a warning I had swallowed too late. How do you sit across the breakfast table from someone for 2 years and not see this? The answer is simple. You do not see it because you trust them. You trust the hand that touches your shoulder in the morning. You trust the voice that says goodnight. And that trust is not a gift. It is a tool. And the person you gave it to has been using it to take you apart, one transfer at a time. Where did the money go? I asked. Single account. Registered under Priscilla Vance's name. Standard brokerage, nothing exotic. But the structuring keeping every transfer under the reporting threshold, that's not amateur work. Someone advised her on how to do this. And under Virginia law, Boyd met my eyes. Moving marital assets from a spouse over 65 through a pattern of concealment and structured transfers. That is not just fraud, sir, under D.C. and Virginia statutes. That is classified as elder financial abuse. I placed both hands flat on the table. The bank statements rustled under my palms. I stared at that number, $1,250,000, and I understood that the woman who had kissed me goodbye that morning was not the woman I had married. She was someone else entirely. She had been someone else for a very long time. Boyd let the silence hold. Then he reached for the third legal pad, the one he had kept face down at the edge of the table, and said quietly that he had not shown me the worst part yet. The worst part was not the money. Boyd turned over the third legal pad and slid a stack of billing invoices across the table. And what I saw there made the stolen funds feel almost simple by comparison. "Sheldon Kirkland," Boyd said. "Your estate attorney. He's been billing Lorraine separately for the past 5 months. 14 invoices, all coded as document preparation. Sheldon Kirkland." I had trusted that man for 11 years. He had drafted my will after Helen died, sat with me in his walnut-paneled office on Connecticut Avenue, while I decided how to divide a lifetime of work between the people I loved. He knew every account, every asset, every beneficiary. And for 5 months he had been taking private calls from my wife. "What documents?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. Boyd set the final page in front of me. It was a draft cover sheet, not the will itself, but the routing memo attached to it. Sheldon's letterhead, Lorraine's name in the client field, and in the subject line, 4 words that emptied the air from the room. Revised last will and testament. It's a new will, sir. I couldn't access the full document, but the billing notes reference beneficiary restructuring. Your son and his wife don't exist in it. Everything flows to Lorraine and a trust under Priscilla's name. I read the cover sheet twice, then a third time. The desk lamp threw a hard circle of light across the invoices and the bank statements and the legal pads. And outside the window, the Potomac was black and still. And I sat there in the middle of all that evidence like a man standing in the wreckage of a house he had built with his own hands. Let me be clear about what this means. My wife had not just been stealing from me. She had been building a future in which my own son and the woman he loved simply did not exist. Not reduced, not diminished, erased. As if Garrison had never been born. As if Celeste had never knelt on that workroom floor and built something beautiful out of nothing. Lorraine was not just taking money. She was rewriting the story of my family. And she had hired my own attorney to hold the pen. She doesn't just want to control the money, Boyd said quietly. She wants to erase them from the family. I did not answer. I gathered the invoices into a stack, squared the edges, and set them beside the bank statements. 2 piles, one representing theft, the other representing something closer to annihilation. I placed my hands flat on the table between them, and I held very still until the urge to drive to Sheldon Kirkland's house at 11 o'clock at night and put him through his own front door passed through me and out the other side. Boyd left at midnight. I walked him to the door and locked it behind him. The house was dark. Lorraine was already asleep upstairs, I could smell traces of her jasmine perfume drifting down the stairwell, and the scent that had once meant comfort now carried something rancid underneath it, like flowers left too long in water that had gone sour. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from knowing something terrible about someone you love and choosing to carry it alone. Not because you are brave, but because the people you are protecting are not ready for the weight. Celeste was not ready. Garrison was not ready. And I was not ready to watch their faces when they learned what Lorraine had been doing in the dark. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hands and typed a message to Celeste. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. I love you." The reply came back in 40 seconds. She was still awake, 27 years old, and probably sitting in her studio with pins between her teeth, working on something she believed in. "Thank you, Dad. I found the sunflowers. They're already in water. Love you." She called me Dad. Not Eugene. Not Mr. Ashford. Dad. She had started using that word 2 years ago, shyly at first, as if she were asking permission. I had never corrected her. I had never wanted to. And tonight, reading that word on a glowing screen in a dark bedroom while her mother-in-law slept down the hall with a forged will and a stolen fortune, I understood exactly what that word was protecting her from. I held the phone for a long time after the screen went dark. I would not say a word to anyone, not Celeste, not Garrison, until I was ready to move. Until every piece was in place and every exit was blocked. I turned off the lamp and walked to the bathroom. In the mirror above the sink, I saw my own face in the blue dark. My hands were shaking. Not from tonight. They had been shaking for months. A fine, persistent tremor I had been ignoring, the way you ignore a slow leak in a roof. And standing there on the cold tile, I realized I could no longer ignore it. When did I start getting old? That was the question I had been asking myself for months. Standing in that same bathroom, gripping the same porcelain edge. But the morning after Boyd's revelations, with the cold tile under my bare feet and the early light cutting across the mirror, I stopped asking and started counting. The tremor had begun in January. I remembered because I had fumbled a pen during a board advisory call. A video conference with 6 people watching me chase a rolling Mont Blanc across a mahogany desk. I laughed it off. 69 years old. What did I expect? In February, I lost a word mid-sentence at dinner, not a complicated word. The word was mortgage. I sat there with my mouth open while Lorraine smiled and filled it in for me. The way you help a child who is learning to read. In March, the fatigue arrived. A heaviness behind my eyes that no amount of sleep could lift, as though my body were running through something thicker than air. I had blamed all of it on age, on the natural erosion of a body that had worked hard for 7 decades and earned the right to slow down. But standing in that bathroom, I started lining up the months against what Boyd had shown me. The tremor began in January. The first structured transfer hit Priscilla's account in November. Sheldon Kirkland's billing to Lorraine started in December. By January, my hands were shaking. By March, I was tired all the time. By May, I was forgetting words I had used in contracts worth more than some countries' annual budgets. I want you to think about the person who pours your coffee, who hands you your glass at dinner, who touches your shoulder in the morning and says you look tired. You should rest. Let me take care of things. Now imagine that every single time they did it, they were watching you slow down and counting on it. I gripped the sink and looked at my own face. The eyes were still sharp, whatever was happening to my hands. And my memory had not reached my eyes yet. But the skin beneath them was gray in a way it had not been a year ago. And the veins on the backs of my hands stood out like rigging on a ship that had been at sea too long. I remembered something Lorraine had said in April, running her fingers across my knuckles while we sat on the back porch. Your hands shake a little now. I think it's charming. It makes you human. Charming. She had called the evidence of my deterioration charming. And I had believed her. Because when the person poisoning you is also the person holding your hand, you do not feel the needle. You feel the warmth. I walked back into the bedroom. The curtains were still drawn. Lorraine was not there. She had already gone downstairs, and I could hear the faint sound of the coffee maker through the floor. On my nightstand sat the wine glass from last night. The same glass she poured for me every evening. A glass of wine is the most intimate weapon there is. It arrives with a smile, in a moment of trust, at the end of a day when your guard is lowest. The person who hands it to you gets to sit across the room and watch it work. And you thank them for it. I picked up the glass. The bedroom was dim, but a sliver of morning sun had found its way through the gap in the curtains. And I held the glass into that narrow beam of light. The ritual was always the same. Every evening. Lorraine opened a new bottle, always red, always from the small rack she kept in the butler's pantry. She poured one glass for me. She did not pour one for herself. She drank white, she said, from a separate bottle at her own pace. She handed me the glass directly. Always directly. Her fingers to mine. I had thought it was tenderness. A small domestic ceremony between a husband and wife. One of those rituals that hold a marriage together the way stitching holds fabric invisible until you pull it out. But what if it was not tenderness? What if it was dosing? I tilted the glass slowly. At the bottom, where the last half swallow of wine had dried overnight, there was a thin amber ring. In the sunlight it looked almost golden. A faint residue that could have been tannins, could have been sediment, could have been nothing at all, or could have been everything. I set the glass down very carefully on the nightstand, the way you set down evidence at a crime scene. I did not wash it. I did not move it. I left it exactly where it was, with the morning light still touching that amber ring, and I walked downstairs to pour my own coffee for the first time in 2 years. I told Lorraine I had a dentist appointment and drove 30 minutes in the wrong direction to find out if my wife had been poisoning me. She was still half asleep when I left a shape under the duvet. One hand curled on the pillow where my head should have been. I said the words casually, car keys already in hand. And she murmured something about picking up toothpaste on the way back. A perfectly normal exchange between a husband and wife on a Tuesday morning. Except that the wine glass on my nightstand was now sealed inside a plastic bag in my briefcase. And the man driving north on the George Washington Parkway was not going to any dentist. The parkway was quiet at that hour. Virginia pines blurring past on both sides. The Potomac somewhere below to my left. And the road stretching ahead toward Bethesda like a question I did not want answered. I had commanded cargo vessels across the Atlantic. I had fired men who lied to my face without raising my voice. And here I was, gripping a steering wheel with trembling hands, sneaking away from my own home to get my blood drawn, because the woman who slept beside me might be the reason those hands would not hold still. The bottle. Her hands on the cork, the pour, the glass extended toward me with a smile that touched her eyes. The same ritual every single night. For 2 years. Have you ever driven somewhere, hoping you were wrong about the reason you were going? That is what the ride to Bethesda felt like. 40 minutes of praying for a negative result, while knowing in your bones that the prayer was wasted. The clinic was a private practice on a side street off Old Georgetown Road. No signage visible from the road. The kind of place that handled sensitive testing for people who could not afford to have results appear in a shared medical record. I had found it through Boyd, who had found it through a contact at Walter Reed. Dr. Ulrich, the clinic's senior toxicologist, was a quiet man in his early 60s, with reading glasses perched on his forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent decades listening to things people were afraid to say out loud. He led me to an examination room that smelled of antiseptic and cold air conditioning, and gestured toward a vinyl chair that creaked when I sat down. He asked the standard questions, medications, supplements, alcohol intake. When I got to the wine, I kept my voice even. 1 glass of red wine every evening. always poured for me by the same person, always from a bottle only she opens. She drinks white from a separate bottle. We never share. Dr. Aldrich had been writing on a clipboard. His pen stopped. He did not look up immediately, but his hand stayed frozen above the page for a beat too long. And when he did raise his eyes, the professional neutrality was still there, but something behind it had shifted. Recognition. Not of me, of the pattern. Dr. Aldrich did not say the word poison. He did not have to. His face said it when I finished describing the ritual. Mr. Ashford, I am going to order a comprehensive panel. Heavy metals, organophosphates, and a few other markers I want to check. We will have results within 24 hours. He paused and removed his glasses. In the meantime, I would strongly recommend that you stop consuming anything you have not prepared yourself. Anything. Food, beverages, supplements. If someone else's hands touched it before it reached yours, set it aside until we know what we are dealing with. The blood draw took 4 minutes. I watched the needle slide in and the vial fill with something dark and red. And I thought about how strange it was that the same substance running through my veins might contain the answer to whether my marriage was a partnership or a long, quiet assassination. I walked out of the clinic into the Bethesda morning. The parking lot asphalt was already warm under the June sun, and my mouth was dry. I had not eaten, had not drunk anything since the coffee I poured myself at dawn. My first self-poured coffee in 2 years. I was still thinking about that when my phone rang. Boyd's name on the screen. I answered. His voice was different. In 9 years I had heard Boyd deliver bad news with the same flat, measured cadence he used for everything else. This was not that. This was stripped down, bare. Sir, you need to get to MedStar Georgetown, now. I was already reaching for the car door. What happened? A pause. 1 second. 2. It's Celeste. I broke every speed limit between Bethesda and Georgetown, and the only thought in my head was a prayer I had not said since the Marines. The parkway blurred into city streets, the clinic still a phantom weight on my left arm where the needle had gone in. And I pulled into the MedStar Georgetown parking structure 11 minutes after Boyd's call. A nurse pointed me toward a curtain bay at the end of a fluorescent corridor. When I pulled the curtain aside, Celeste was sitting upright on the gurney, with her legs over the edge, trying to look like she was fine. She was not fine. Butterfly strips held together a gash above her left eyebrow. Her right wrist was wrapped in a compression bandage. Through the gap in the hospital gown, I could see bruising spreading across her ribs in a dark bloom that had not finished forming. I'm fine, Dad. It looks worse than it is. She winced when she said it. She called me Dad, and the gash above her eyebrow was shaped like a question I intended to answer. Boyd had given me the basics on the phone. Celeste had been driving the boutique's delivery van on M Street when an SUV rear-ended her at a merge, hard enough to send the van into a parked car. The SUV never stopped, no plates. A witness described dark gray tinted windows, deliberate acceleration before impact. Deliberate. That word sat in my chest like a stone. Tell me what happened, I said. Everything. The van was loaded with sample gowns for a client preview. I was near Wisconsin Avenue when the SUV hit me from behind. It wasn't a tap. It felt intentional, like someone wanted the van to spin. There is nothing in the world that prepares you for seeing someone you love in a hospital bed, and knowing that the person who put them there is waiting for you at home with dinner ready. I sat in the plastic chair beside her and took her unbandaged hand. Celeste, has anything else happened at the boutique? Anything you haven't told me or Garrison? She looked at me for a long moment. The fluorescent light made the bruise above her eye look worse, the butterfly strips casting tiny shadows across the cut. I watched her decide whether to tell me, weigh the cost of saying it out loud against carrying it alone one more day. Then she told me. My laptop disappeared from the boutique 2 weeks ago. Client records, financial projections, supplier contacts, everything. I thought I'd misplaced it. Then, 3 days later, a couture piece I'd been finishing for a showcase, a gown worth $55,000, was found with its interior seams cut. Someone knew exactly where to cut so the dress would come apart during a fitting. Her hand tightened on mine. Last week, someone filed an anonymous complaint to Ramona Blackwell, claiming I was embezzling from the business account. Ramona called me. She was polite, but I could hear it. She was already considering whether it was true. She had been carrying this for weeks without telling anyone. Not Garrison, not me, because she did not want to be the daughter-in-law who made accusations against the family without proof. So she absorbed every blow and told herself she was imagining a pattern where there was only coincidence. I kept telling myself it was bad luck, she said quietly, that I was overreacting, that things just go wrong sometimes when you're running a small business and you don't have experience. She looked at me with steady, exhausted eyes. I wasn't being paranoid, was I? No, I said. You were not. I sat there in that curtained bay with the hospital intercom paging overhead and the faint chemical smell of bandage adhesive between us. And I understood something with a clarity that felt like the floor dropping out. Whatever was happening to me, the trembling hands, the fatigue, the wine glass sealed in a bag that morning, was also happening to her. Different methods, different weapons, same architect. And that architect was sleeping in my house, wearing my ring, waiting for both of us to break. I squeezed Celeste's hand and told her to rest. I did not tell her about the wine glass or the toxicology panel or the stolen funds. Not yet. She had enough weight on those bruised ribs. But as I walked out of that hospital room, I made a promise to the woman lying in that bed, the same kind of promise I had made to Helen 11 years ago. This time, I would keep it. The call from Bethesda came while I was still in the hospital corridor outside Celeste's room. And the word Dr. Aldrich used was not age. Temazepam, he said. A benzodiazepine sedative. The levels in your blood are consistent with 5 to 9 months of controlled, low-dose administration. Mr. Ashford. This was not accidental. I leaned against the corridor wall. A nurse pushed a cart past me. The wheels squeaked against the linoleum and the sound seemed to come from very far away. The dosing was calibrated. Dr. Aldrich continued. Small enough that you would attribute the effects to normal aging fatigue, tremor, mild cognitive dulling. Large enough to keep you suggestible. Less likely to question things. Less likely to push back. How would it be administered? Dissolved in any dark liquid. Red wine would mask the taste almost entirely. I closed my eyes. The bottle she opened herself every evening. The glass she placed directly into my hand. The smile. I had thought every one of those moments was tenderness. And every one of them had been a dose. Mr. Ashford, you need to stop consuming anything you haven't prepared yourself. I said this yesterday, but I want to be explicit now. This is a criminal matter. I am required to document these findings, and I strongly suggest you involve law enforcement. I thanked him. I ended the call. I stood in that hospital corridor for a full minute without moving. And I thought about what it means to be poisoned by someone you trust. It does not feel like poison. It feels like getting older. It feels like losing a step. Like the world moving slightly faster than you can follow. And that is exactly how it is designed to feel. Invisible, gradual, and wrapped in the warmth of a woman who kisses you goodnight while the drug she fed you pulls you under. I drove home to Alexandria. The hospital smell was still on my jacket, and the toxicology report was on the passenger seat. And I drove with both hands steady on the wheel for the first time in months, because the temazepam was clearing my system now that I had stopped drinking the wine. Boyd was waiting in the study. He had a traffic camera printout on the desk. The SUV, he said. Dark gray Chevrolet Tahoe. Rented this morning from an enterprise on Columbia Pike in Arlington. The name on the rental contract is fabricated a Helen Marsh. No matching ID in any database. but the payment card traces back to a brokerage account we already know. He set the printout down and looked at me. Priscilla Vance's account. The same one holding the structured transfers. The room was very still. Evening light was fading through the study windows, turning the leather chairs amber and then brown. The cold coffee from that morning was still on the desk where I had left it, untouched, and the phantom taste of last night's wine sat on my tongue with a meaning it had never carried before. They had not just stolen from me. They had not just rewritten my will. They had tried to kill the woman my son loved, and they had been slowly killing me with a glass of wine and a goodnight kiss. They tried to kill her. Boyd. Yes, sir. The rental car, the poisoning, the sabotage at the boutique, it's all connected. It's all the same operation. Yes, sir. I set the toxicology report beside the traffic camera printout. 2 pieces of paper on a mahogany desk. One proved my wife had been drugging me for the better part of a year. The other proved her daughter had paid for a vehicle to run down my daughter-in-law on a Georgetown street. I looked at them side by side under the desk lamp, and I said it out loud for the first time. This is no longer about money. Boyd nodded. He picked up his pen and waited. I gave him 3 orders. The first was to freeze every joint account I shared with Lorraine before the banks opened tomorrow. Every checking, savings, and brokerage account bearing both our names. The second was to find and retain Catherine Doyle, a litigation attorney on K Street whom Boyd's contacts at Walter Reed had recommended for exactly this kind of war. The third was simpler and more immediate. Go through the house tonight. Every bottle of wine Lorraine keeps in the butler's pantry. Every opened bottle in the kitchen. Every glass she has touched. More all of it. Replace the rack with new bottles, different vintages, different labels. When she notices, I'll tell her I restocked for the summer. Boyd wrote it all down without comment. Then he looked up. And if she doesn't believe the restocking story, then she'll know I know. And that's a conversation I intend to have on my terms, not hers, by midnight. Boyd had carried 2 cases of Bordeaux out the back door and replaced the rack with bottles from a wine shop in Fairfax that Lorraine had never visited. The joint accounts were frozen by a single call to the bank's priority line. Boyd had the authorization codes I had given him years ago for emergencies. And Catherine Doyle's name was written on a notepad beside my phone. Circled twice. 3 orders. 3 escape routes sealed before my wife opened her eyes in the morning. Removed wine bottles from your own home because your wife might be using them to poison you. That is not a sentence that belongs in anyone's life. But there I was, standing in the kitchen at 1 in the morning, watching Boyd carry a case of red out the back door into the Virginia night with the care of a man handling evidence. Because that is exactly what it was. The bottles would go to Catherine Doyle's office. If any of them contained what the Bethesda clinic had found in my blood, we would know. Lorraine came downstairs at 7. She opened the butler's pantry, paused for a moment, and then closed it. She said nothing about the new labels. She poured herself coffee and asked if I had slept well. I told her I had. It was the easiest lie I had ever told, because by then I had learned it from the best. That afternoon, I drove to a brick duplex in Falls Church where Faye Pennington lived alone with a cat named Oliver and 14 years of loyalty to my household. Faye was 52 years old, had managed every detail of the Ashford home since Helen was alive, and noticed everything while saying almost nothing. She was the kind of woman who remembered your doctor's appointment before you did, and left fresh towels folded on your bed without being asked. When she opened the door and saw my face, she knew. She led me to her kitchen table, which smelled like cinnamon and dish soap, and she sat across from me with her hands clasped and her eyes already red. "How long?" I asked. "Since February," she said. Her voice was steady but thin, like thread pulled too tight. "Priscilla found something about my son, something old. A mistake he made years ago. A loan he took from a former employer. He paid it back. It was settled. But Priscilla had the records. And she said if I didn't cooperate, she would make sure it ruined him. What did she want? Your calendar. Your schedule, where you'd be, when you'd be home, when you'd be out. And she wanted confirmation of where Celeste's boutique was. The exact address, the floor, the hours. Faye Pennington had worked for me for 14 years. She had never missed a day. She had held my hand at Helen's funeral and stood in the back row without being asked. And when she told me what Priscilla had done to her, I understood something I should have seen sooner. Lorraine did not just destroy the people in front of her. She destroyed the people around them too, turning loyalty into leverage, trust into a weapon, until everyone in her orbit was either a tool or a target. I gave her the calendar, Faye said quietly. I gave her the address, but I would not give her your medical portal login. She asked for it twice. That was the one thing I would not do. She was crying now. Not loudly, just tears moving down her face without sound. The way people cry when they have been carrying something too heavy for too long, and the weight finally leaves their hands. I'm so sorry. Mr. Ashford, I'm so sorry. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. She flinched, then held still. You are not the villain in this story. Faye, you were used by someone who has been using people for a very long time. She offered me tea. I drank it, the first thing I had accepted from someone else's hand since learning about the poisoning. It tasted like trust, and I needed to remember what that felt like. Faye wrote her statement that night. 3 pages in careful handwriting, every date, every request, every threat Priscilla had made. She signed it at 11 and called Catherine Doyle before she turned off the light. One more ally. One more piece. But the next afternoon, while searching through Lorraine's old papers in the study filing cabinet, looking for anything connected to the structured transfers, I found something I was not looking for. A manila folder, brittle with age, containing incorporation documents for a fashion label called Velour, co-founded by 2 women. One was Lorraine. The other's name had been crossed out so many times with black ink that the paper was torn through in places. Someone had wanted that name erased. I was not looking for a secret. I was looking for a bank statement, one of the older joint account records that might show when the structured transfers had begun. But the locked drawer in the study filing cabinet held more than numbers. Behind a stack of tax returns from 2019, my fingers found a manila folder that did not belong with the rest. It was brittle. The tab was unlabeled. Inside were incorporation documents. A 12-page business plan with fabric swatches stapled to the appendix, and a handful of press clippings from trade magazines I had never seen Lorraine read. The company was called Velour, a fashion label, co-founded 15 years ago by 2 women. One of them was Lorraine, and the other was identified on the incorporation papers as her older sister. I set the folder on the desk and sat very still. 7 years of marriage, thousands of conversations over dinner, on the back porch, in the car, in bed in the dark when people say the things they would never say in daylight. And not once, not a single time, had Lorraine mentioned having a sister. Not at our wedding, not when I told her about my own family, not when she asked me about Helen, about Garrison, about the people I had loved and lost. She had listened to every detail of my history, while erasing an entire person from hers. Think about what kind of person does that. Think about what it takes to remove your own blood from the story of your life so completely that a man who shares your bed for 7 years never hears the name. I turned the pages slowly. The business plan was meticulous market analysis, supplier lists, a production timeline that showed real ambition. The press clippings told the same story. 2 seasons of reviews, a small but growing following. Trade publications calling Velour a label to watch. There were photographs, runway shots from what looked like a small showcase. Models in structured gowns that reminded me, with a sickness in my stomach, of the kind of work Celeste did now. Then the documents changed. The later pages were not about growth. They were about collapse. Bankruptcy filings dated 20 years ago. Vendor lawsuits alleging non-payment. A forensic accounting summary that used the phrase irreconcilable management disputes language I recognized from shipping contracts when one partner had been consumed by the other. And the sister's name. It appeared on the early incorporation documents in clean, typed letters. But on every page after the first year, every amendment, every filing, every internal memo, the name had been crossed out. Not once. Not with a single line drawn through it, the way you correct a typo. The name had been scratched over with black ink. Again and again, with such pressure that the pen had torn through the paper in several places. The marks were not corrections. They were not redactions. They were something closer to an exorcism, someone trying to scratch a person out of existence, the way you would scratch a mistake out of a ledger. I turned to the bankruptcy filing. The forensic summary described a pattern that made my hands go cold. Supplier relationships severed without explanation. Client accounts redirected. Financial records altered to show losses that did not exist. The sister had filed a civil complaint alleging deliberate internal sabotage. The complaint was withdrawn 6 weeks later. No settlement on record. And after that, the sister's name appeared nowhere. Not in the velour documents, not in any public record I could find in the filing cabinet. Not in Lorraine's life. My wife had a sister. My wife had co-founded a fashion label with that sister. And then my wife had destroyed the label, erased the sister, and started over as if none of it had ever happened. The house was quiet. Lorraine was at a charity luncheon across the river. The study clock ticked against the silence. And the old paper smelled like dust and ink and the kind of secrets that survive only because no one thought to look in a locked drawer behind the tax returns. I held the torn page up to the desk lamp and tilted it until the scratched-out letters caught the light at an angle. The ink was heavy, but the impression of the original type was still pressed into the paper beneath it. I could read it, just barely, at the right angle, with a lamp close enough to throw shadows into the grooves. The name was still there, and that name, that woman, was someone I now needed to find. Because if Lorraine had done this before, to her own sister, to her own blood, then what she was doing to Celeste was not an impulse. It was not greed or jealousy or a moment of cruelty. It was a pattern. And patterns do not stop. They repeat until someone breaks them. A pattern does not stop on its own. Someone has to break it. That thought carried me from Alexandria to K Street that evening, with the velour folder on the passenger seat and every piece of evidence I had gathered in 4 days stacked inside my briefcase. The receptionist's desk was empty. The lobby was dark. But the corner office on the 7th floor still had its lights on. And the woman behind the desk looked up when I knocked on the open door, as if late evening visitors carrying manila folders were exactly the kind of trouble she had been expecting. Catherine Doyle was a litigation attorney in her late 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a clip, a corner office that smelled like old books and fresh coffee, and no patience for clients who wasted her evenings without good reason. She had spent 22 years dismantling fraud cases in the district, and Boyd's contacts at Walter Reed had called her the best in the city for exactly this kind of war. "Mr. Ashford, you said on the phone this couldn't wait until morning," she said. "Show me why." "Because by morning, my daughter-in-law might not have a business left to save." She gestured to a chair. I sat. I opened the briefcase and laid 3 documents on her desk. The toxicology report from Bethesda, the velour bankruptcy filing, and the incorporation page with the crossed-out name. Catherine read the toxicology report first, her expression unchanged. She turned to the bankruptcy filing and spent 2 minutes on the forensic accounting summary. Then she reached the incorporation page and stopped. "Lorraine Ashford," she said quietly. She set the page down and looked at me over her reading glasses. "Your wife inquired about retaining this firm 4 years ago, before your marriage. I declined her as a client." Why? Inconsistencies in her account of events. I couldn't verify her version of a property dispute she wanted us to litigate. And when I pressed for documentation, she withdrew the inquiry. I remember her because she was very composed and very convincing. And the things she was saying did not add up. How many years had I slept beside someone whose real face I had never seen? Catherine Doyle had spent one meeting with Lorraine and caught what I had missed across 7 years of marriage, the gap between the performance and the truth. Catherine picked up the toxicology report again. Temazepam. Deliberate dosing. That alone is criminal assault aggravated, given your age and the duration. But this, she tapped the velour filing, this is what changes everything. Your wife didn't stumble into sabotage, she refined it. If the pattern holds from the sister to your daughter-in-law, we're not looking at a domestic dispute. We're looking at predatory intent established across multiple victims over more than a decade. What do you need from me? Everything you think you know about your wife. And then I'll find what you don't. I laid the rest on her desk. The bank records showing the structured transfers. Faye Pennington's signed statement. The traffic camera printout linking the rental SUV to Priscilla's account. Boyd's timeline connecting the first transfer to the onset of my symptoms. Each document I placed on Catherine's desk felt like a brick pulled from the wall of my own house, necessary and destructive. Each one weakening the structure that had held my life together, while revealing that the structure had been rotten from the start. Catherine organized the documents into 3 stacks, criminal, civil, and investigative, with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. Then she pointed to the crossed-out name on the incorporation page. The sister. Do you know where she is? No. I didn't know she existed until this afternoon. If I find her, and she corroborates this pattern, your wife faces criminal prosecution, not civil, criminal. The poisoning, the financial fraud, the conspiracy with her daughter, all of it becomes a prosecutable case with pattern evidence. But once I open that door, you cannot close it. She paused. Your marriage will be over. You understand that? I looked down at my wedding ring. The gold was scratched from 11 years of wear, 7 with Lorraine. 4 before that, when it sat in a drawer after Helen died, and I thought I would never put it on again. I had put it on for Lorraine because I believed she was the second chance I did not deserve. I had been wrong about that. I had been wrong about a great many things. I need to know who she was before she became Mike. Catherine nodded. She walked me to the elevator. The corridor was dark, our footsteps the only sound on the marble floor. As the elevator doors opened, she said one more thing. Mr. Ashford, the sister. If she's still alive, there's a reason your wife made sure no one could find her. The doors closed. I stood alone in the descending elevator and felt the weight of what that meant settle into my chest, like something I would carry for a very long time. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my study with every photo album from the first years of our marriage spread across the desk, turning pages under the lamp, searching Lorraine's face for some sign I should have caught. A cruelty in the smile, a coldness behind the eyes, something. But every photograph showed the same woman, warm, composed, present. The mask was flawless. That was the worst part. By 7 in the morning, I was back on K Street. Catherine's office smelled like coffee and paper, and she was already at her desk with a file open that had not been there the night before. She had worked through the night too. Sit down, she said. No pleasantries. She slid a stack of court filings across the table. The documents were from a county court filing 20 years old. A civil complaint, filed by Lorraine's sister against Lorraine, alleging fraud, embezzlement, and intentional destruction of business assets related to their shared fashion label. The dollar amounts are almost identical to what's happening to your daughter-in-law's boutique, Catherine said. Supplier accounts redirected, client relationships poisoned, and $55,000 drained from the label's operating account into a personal trust in your wife's name before the business collapsed. $55,000. The same figure as the couture piece Celeste had been working on, the one found with its seams cut. I did not believe in coincidences anymore. What happened to the case? I asked. Dropped. Voluntarily dismissed 6 weeks after filing. No settlement on record. No explanation. The sister simply withdrew and disappeared. You spend 30 years building a career on reading people, and you think you know their history when you marry them. But history, I was learning, is just the version they let you see. Lorraine had shown me a curated past, no sister, no failed business, no lawsuits, just a woman who had reinvented herself so thoroughly that the person she had been before simply ceased to exist. After the dismissal, Catherine continued, the sister vanished from public records. No tax filings, no business registrations, no social media presence, no voter registration, nothing. People don't just disappear. No, they don't. Not unless someone makes it worth their while or makes staying visible dangerous. Catherine removed her glasses and set them on the desk. The dismissed lawsuit contained a sealed exhibit. I don't know what's in it yet, but whatever it was, it scared your wife enough to pay for silence. That means evidence exists. And if we can unseal it, this case accelerates significantly. Can you find the sister? I already have a skip tracer working on it. But if she's been hiding for 20 years, she may not want to be found. I stood up and walked to Catherine's window. K Street was waking up below. Taxis, joggers, a delivery truck backing into an alley. Ordinary life, moving at its ordinary pace. While I stood 7 floors above it, learning that the woman I had married had destroyed her own sister the same way she was now destroying my daughter-in-law. 2 women, 2 businesses, the same hands pulling them apart. Catherine came to stand beside me. She held the velour court filing in one hand and her notes on Celeste's situation in the other. Look at the parallels, she said. Supplier interference, financial bleed disguised as bad luck, reputation attacks through third parties, anonymous complaints designed to erode trust. She didn't improvise against Celeste. She ran the same operation she perfected a decade ago. She didn't even change the method, I said. She just found a new target, which is exactly what makes this prosecutable. Pattern establishes intent. 1 victim is a dispute. 2 victims with identical methods a decade apart. That is predatory behavior, and a jury will see it. I turned from the window. This isn't her first time doing this. No, Catherine said, it is not. She closed the file and looked at me over her reading glasses, with an expression that had shifted from professional assessment to something more personal, the look of a woman who had spent a career watching people make the hardest decisions of their lives. There's one more thing. The skip tracer found a current address for the sister. She's been living under her married name for the last 20 years. Catherine paused. She's 40 minutes from here. I gripped the armrest of the chair I had just left. 40 minutes. Lorraine's sister. The woman she had erased from every document, every conversation. Every version of her life she had shown me had been living less than an hour's drive away for nearly a decade. While I poured Lorraine's wine, while I kissed her goodnight, while the woman she had destroyed lived in quiet exile close enough to see the same sunset over the Chesapeake. 40 minutes. All this time, 40 minutes away. I carried that number home from Catherine's office like a splinter under the skin. And by the next morning, Boyd and I were tearing through every record in the house, trying to close that distance to 0. Boyd spread 6 years of Lorraine's old address books across my dining table and said, "If your wife buried her sister, she left a seam somewhere. We just have to find it." Lorraine was at a charity luncheon across the river. We had until 3 o'clock. Boyd started with the attic box's old correspondence, tax documents, Christmas card lists going back a decade. I pulled insurance records, phone bills, anything with a name or number I did not recognize. Boyd worked methodically, cross-referencing every name against public databases on his laptop, while I turned pages and tried not to think about the fact that I was searching my own wife's belongings, like a detective at a crime scene. Your wife kept every receipt from 2014, Boyd said after an hour. Department stores, restaurants, dry cleaning, but not a single photograph of her own sister. Not a letter, not a birthday card. Not one mention in any document going back 30 years. He closed an address book and set it aside. That's not forgetting. That's erasing. Lorraine told me Nadine moved abroad. France, she said. I never questioned it. Nobody who moves to France closes every American bank account the same week. Searching for Nadine felt like trying to read a book where someone had torn out every other page. The story was there in corporation documents, court filings, a supplier contact list. But the person at the center of it had been carefully, systematically removed. Every lead dead-ended. Phone numbers disconnected. Forwarding addresses that looped back to P.O. boxes closed years ago. A mailing address in Silver Spring that turned out to be a UPS store that had changed ownership twice. By midday, Boyd had checked the address Catherine's skip tracer had found. It was a rental property in Laurel, Maryland, sold 2 years ago. Nadine was already gone. The married name the skip tracer used yielded 3 possible matches in the Mid-Atlantic region. 2 were wrong ages. The third had no digital footprint at all. Right age, right region, Boyd said, staring at his screen. But she's a ghost. No social media, no voter registration, no property records since 2019. If this is her, she knows how to stay invisible. Someone taught her how to hide. Or someone made her afraid enough to learn. What do you say to a woman your wife destroyed? Hello. I am the man who never noticed. I am the husband who poured wine with the woman who ruined your life and never once asked why she had no family photographs on the mantle. The introduction I would have to make if I ever found Nadine would be an apology before it was anything else. Boyd went back to the court filings Catherine had pulled. He was looking for something specific. Not the legal arguments, but the exhibits, the appendices, the supporting documentation that lawyers attach and no one reads. In the velour supplier contact list, included as Exhibit D, he found it. An email address, defunct domain, no longer active. But the prefix followed a pattern first initial. Maiden name, followed by 5 digits that matched an Annapolis zip code. Boyd traced the domain registration through an archived Who Is record. It had been registered to a small business co-working space on West Street in Annapolis. The space still existed. The email is dead, Boyd said, but the co-working space might have a forwarding address, or a face someone remembers. Annapolis is an hour away. Then we go tomorrow. But I need you to understand something. Boyd closed the laptop halfway and looked at me. If she's been hiding this long, she won't trust you just because you're Lorraine's husband. That might be the last thing she trusts. You're going to walk in there carrying the name of the woman who destroyed her. And you're going to ask her to believe you're different. I know. Do you? Because if she runs, we may not find her again. I did not answer. He was right, and we both knew it. The only lead we had was a defunct email address and a co-working space that might or might not remember a woman who might or might not still be there. It was thin. It was all we had. Boyd began packing up his laptop. Then he stopped. He turned the screen back toward me. The co-working space in Annapolis. I just pulled their current tenant list from a cached business directory. He pointed at a name halfway down the page. It's not Nadine's married name. It's a new name entirely. But the unit number matches the old email's domain registration exactly. I stared at the screen. A different name. The same unit. She had not left. She had simply become someone else again. And she was still there. 1 hour east. Waiting behind a name I had never heard. In a building connected to a dead email address from a life my wife had tried to erase. We left the Annapolis lead for tomorrow. That evening, Boyd came back to the house with something worse. A full investigative report that turned everything I thought I understood about Lorraine's motive inside out. Boyd did not sit down when he came through the door. He stood in the hallway with his briefcase still in hand and said, "We need to talk before your wife gets home." He laid a timeline across the dining table, handwritten, spanning 15 years. On the left, Velour. On the right, Celeste's boutique. In between. A gap of silence where Lorraine had reinvented herself, married me, and waited. The money she took from Velour. She burned through it in 8 months, Boyd said. She didn't steal to get rich, she stole to make sure her sister had nothing. The financial destruction wasn't the goal. It was the exhaust. Then what was the goal? Control, elimination. Both times she targeted a younger woman whose creative talent threatened her sense of herself. The sister built velour from a sketch on a napkin. Celeste built the boutique from a single sewing machine. In both cases, Lorraine couldn't compete on skill, so she competed on destruction. There are things you can forgive. A lie told in panic, a moment of weakness, even cruelty born from pain. Because pain makes people do things they would not do in the light. But a pattern is different. A pattern means she chose it every single time. It means she woke up in the morning, looked at the people around her, and decided again, deliberately, with full awareness, to take them apart. The stolen funds. Boyd continued. They're not sitting in a brokerage account anymore. They're moving. He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward me. Catherine's subpoena requests had pulled bank records I had not seen before. 14 transfers over 3 months. Each one structured just under the reporting threshold, flowing into an offshore account registered in the Cayman Islands under a corporate name I did not recognize. She knows the threshold, Boyd said. Every transfer is under $9,500. This isn't impulsive. This is a premeditated exit strategy. She's going to run. She's already running. She just hasn't left yet. 3 months. She had been building her escape for 3 months while I kissed her goodnight and poured my own coffee and searched her face for signs of the woman I thought I had married. She had been moving money offshore while I sat in Dr. Aldrich's examination chair, while Boyd carried wine bottles out the back door, while Celeste lay in a hospital bed with butterfly strips above her eye. Before I tell you what I decided to do next, before I reveal how close Lorraine actually was to disappearing, I need to ask, are you still with me? Comment your guess in 1 sentence. Do you think Lorraine was planning to vanish alone? Or was she taking someone with her? A quick note, the next part includes some dramatized details to deepen the emotional impact and convey the full weight of what happened. The lesson is what matters. I picked up the phone and called Catherine. Emergency asset freeze, I said. Every offshore transfer you can identify, every account connected to that Cayman entity. I want it locked before she can move another dollar. Catherine's voice was steady. I can file for a temporary restraining order on the accounts by morning. But if she checks her balances and sees a freeze, she'll know you're onto her. And if she runs before we're ready, how long before she has enough to disappear? I asked Boyd. At this rate, 2 weeks, maybe less if she senses we're close. Then we don't have 2 weeks. We have days. I stood at the dining table with the timeline on my left and the offshore records on my right. And I understood something that changed the shape of everything. Lorraine was not going to stop. She was not going to reach a point where she had enough money or enough control or enough damage done and simply stop. She was going to finish what she started with Celeste, drain what was left, and vanish the way she had made her sister vanish. Except this time, she would be the one who disappeared. She was not going to stop. She was going to vanish. I was still on the phone with Catherine when headlights swept across the living room curtains. The twin beams slid across the ceiling and died as a car pulled into the driveway. Boyd looked at the window, then at the bank record still spread across the dining table. She's home, he said. We had 15 seconds. Boyd swept the papers into his briefcase. I closed the laptop. Catherine was still talking when I whispered, "I'll call you back," and ended the call. The front door opened. Lorraine's perfume reached the dining room before she did. Lorraine noticed nothing. She walked past the dining table, cleared with 4 seconds to spare, poured herself a glass of white wine, and asked about my day. I told her I had been reading. She smiled and went upstairs. Boyd left through the back door with his briefcase full of offshore records, while my wife ran a bath 10 feet above my head. The next morning, Boyd and I stood in the back room of Celeste's boutique with the door locked and the blinds drawn. Boyd set his laptop on the cutting table, pulled up 4 camera angles and said, "You're going to want to sit down for this." He had installed the cameras 5 days ago, small wireless units positioned in the workroom, the stockroom, the hallway, and the alley behind the building. Celeste did not know about them. No one did. Boyd pressed play on the first clip. Time-stamped 2 nights ago, 11:14 p.m. The workroom was dark, except for the emergency exit sign casting a red glow across the cutting table. A figure entered through the back hallway using a key not forcing entry, using a copied key. The figure went straight to the dress form in the corner, where Celeste's showcase gown hung. The couture piece she had been finishing for weeks. Priscilla Vance. On camera. Working with a seam ripper. "Watch her hands," Boyd said. No fumbling, no hesitation. She knew exactly which seams to cut, the interior structural seams that hold the bodice together. Invisible from the outside. The dress would look perfect on the hanger. But the moment someone moved in it, the moment a client tried it on for a fitting, it would come apart. I watched Priscilla's hands on that screen, steady, careful, precise. And I thought of Celeste's hands doing the opposite, stitching, building, creating. One pair of hands making something beautiful in the daylight. Another pair undoing it in the dark. And the woman doing the undoing had not fumbled once. Which meant this was not her first time. That dress was Celeste's showcase piece, I said. If it failed at a client fitting, it would have ended her reputation. Which is exactly the point. Boyd switched to the second clip. Exterior camera. The alley behind the boutique. 5 days earlier. The timestamp read 7:42 a.m. Early enough that the street was empty. Late enough that the sun was up and the image was clear. Priscilla again. This time she was crouching beside Celeste's delivery van, reaching under the wheel well on the driver's side. She worked on something for 90 seconds, methodical, unhurried, and then stood. Wiped her hands on a cloth she pulled from her pocket, and walked away. She did not look back. That was hours before Celeste reported her brakes feeling soft on a highway merge. Boyd said. The same day as the hit and run that put her in the hospital. Soft brakes on a highway merge. My daughter-in-law could have died. She could have been crushed in that delivery van on M Street, surrounded by the sample gowns she had sewn with her own hands, and I would have called it an accident. Everyone would have called it an accident. Because that is how this works. The sabotage is designed to look like bad luck, and the violence is designed to look like traffic. She could have killed her, I said. That's not sabotage anymore, Boyd said quietly. That's attempted murder, and it's on camera. I stood up from the cutting table and walked to the window. Celeste's workshop surrounded me, bolts of fabric stacked on shelves, sketches pinned to corkboard, a half-finished hem draped over a mannequin. Everything in this room was evidence of a woman building something with her talent and her time. And everything on Boyd's laptop was evidence of 2 women trying to destroy it. I called Catherine. Criminal referrals, I said. Both of them. Priscilla for the vehicle tampering and the design sabotage. Lorraine for conspiracy, the poisoning, and the financial fraud. I want it all in front of a prosecutor before the end of the week. Boyd copied the footage to 3 separate drives while I talked. One for Catherine, one for the police, one for my safe at home, where Lorraine would never find it. Enough, I said when the call ended. Time to take back what they don't expect. We locked up the boutique and stepped into the Georgetown morning. I was reaching for my car keys when Boyd's phone buzzed. He read the message. Then he looked at me with an expression I had never seen from him before. Not surprise, but something closer to alarm. "The co-working space in Annapolis just called back," he said. "Nadine didn't just work there, she's still there, and she's been waiting for someone to come asking." Nadine would have to wait one more day before I could drive to Annapolis. I needed to do something that could not wait, strip Lorraine of the one weapon she still held over Celeste's business. That night, I drove to Catherine's office to buy back a piece of my own family, without anyone in that family knowing I had done it. How do you acquire 65% of a boutique your daughter-in-law built with her own hands? Through a holding company your wife has never heard of, using a broker who will never say your name. Catherine Doyle had spent the afternoon designing exactly that. "Your family holding company becomes the acquiring entity," she explained, sliding a stack of documents across her desk. "Lorraine invested as a silent partner. Silent partners can be bought out. Silently. The broker contacts her tomorrow as a routine portfolio consolidation offer, private equity firm acquiring retail assets. Your name appears nowhere. And Ramona Blackwell has been looking for an exit since the anonymous embezzlement complaint rattled her. She'll sell the moment she sees a fair number. We approach her first, she's the easier close. The cost was steep. I did not hesitate. Every dollar I spent tonight was a wire I was cutting from the bomb Lorraine had built around Celeste's livelihood. And she would not know the wires were gone until she tried to pull them tight. It felt like diffusing a bomb in the dark. Each signature, each transfer, each line of legal language that shifted ownership from Lorraine's column to mine was another connection severed. Another point of leverage removed from hands that had used leverage like a blade for over a decade. And Lorraine would wake up tomorrow thinking nothing had changed. Catherine worked the phones through the night. I sat in the leather chair across from her desk and listened to one side of conversations that were reshaping my family's future in real time. Ramona closed first. Catherine called her at 10:30, offered fair market value plus a 15% premium, and Ramona accepted within the hour. No counteroffer. No questions. She was relieved to be out, and the speed of her agreement told me she had sensed something wrong long before I had. Lorraine's stake took longer. The broker, a commercial intermediary Catherine used for sensitive transactions, framed the offer as institutional consolidation. A private equity firm building a portfolio of boutique retail brands in the mid-Atlantic. Clean, plausible, boring enough to avoid suspicion. Lorraine's financial advisor, whoever was handling her accounts in Sheldon Kirkland's absence, reviewed the terms and recommended acceptance. At 1:47 in the morning, Catherine set the phone down. Lorraine signed. She took the money without a single question. She thinks she just liquidated a minor investment. She has no idea. No. She has no idea she just lost every financial weapon she held over Celeste's business. No investor authority, no board pressure, no equity threats. It's gone. I signed the transfer documents at 2:14 a.m. Catherine slid the final ownership certificate across the desk, 65% of Celeste's boutique. Held through my family holding company, with Celeste retaining her working stake and full creative control. The pen in my hand was steady. It was the steadiest my hand had been in weeks, and I understood why. For the first time since I had stood outside that frosted glass door, I was not reacting to what Lorraine had done. I was building something she could not tear down. "When do you tell Celeste?" Catherine asked. "When it's safe. Right now. The less she knows, the less Lorraine can extract from her. Celeste doesn't perform well under deception. She's too honest. If Lorraine senses any change in Celeste's behavior, she'll accelerate." Catherine nodded. She walked me to the elevator for the second time that week. And this time the corridor felt different. Not heavy with dread, but charged with something closer to momentum. I stepped out of the building onto K Street at 3 in the morning. The city was empty. A street sweeper hummed 2 blocks south. The air smelled like warm asphalt and the distant river, and I stood there on the sidewalk holding a briefcase that contained the ownership documents for my daughter-in-law's life's work. And I let myself feel, for exactly 10 seconds, something that might have been hope. Then my phone lit up, a text from a number I did not recognize. Annapolis area code. I opened it. Mr. Ashford, my name used to be Nadine. I know why you're looking for me. Come alone. I read it twice. Then a third time. The woman Lorraine had erased the sister who had vanished from every document, every conversation. Every version of the past my wife had constructed was reaching out to me from 40 minutes away. She knew I was looking. She was ready. I got in the car and drove toward Annapolis. Nadine's text glowed on my phone the entire drive to police headquarters. She knows why he's looking and wants to meet alone. I locked the screen and slid it into my breast pocket. Annapolis would wait. What couldn't wait was the manila folder on my passenger seat, thick enough to require a rubber band. The D.C. Metropolitan Police Fraud Division occupied the third floor of a limestone building that smelled of burned coffee and floor wax. A desk sergeant pointed me down a corridor lined with commendation plaques, and at the far end I found the door I needed. Detective Luther Rawlings was a 20-year veteran of the Fraud Division, broad-shouldered and unhurried, with the patient skepticism of a man who'd built cases against senators and CEOs alike. He was 53. His close-cropped hair threaded with silver, and when he looked up from a stack of depositions, his eyes performed the kind of assessment that made guilty people shift in their chairs. I did not shift. Mr. Ashford. He gestured to the metal chair across from him. Catherine Doyle called ahead. Said you'd be bringing me something worth my afternoon. I set the folder on his desk. Worth considerably more than that, Detective. He opened it with the deliberate patience of a man unwrapping evidence at a crime scene. I watched his face as he moved through the layers Boyd and Catherine had assembled. The structured transfers first 24 months of payments into Priscilla Vance's account, each calibrated below the reporting threshold. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The toxicology report came next. Dr. Aldrich's findings on the temazepam. The timeline correlating my declining cognition with Lorraine's increased access to my evening routine. Rawlings pulled a legal pad from his drawer and began writing. The wine, I said. She administered it through a vintage she knew I drank nightly. My physician documented the cognitive symptoms over 4 months. You preserved the original bottle, replaced it with an identical vintage. The original is in a temperature-controlled locker at Catherine's firm. Chain of custody documented. He nodded the kind of nod that said I had done something right, where civilians usually contaminated everything. Then he reached the security footage. Stills showing Priscilla inside Celeste's workshop at 2 in the morning, scissors in hand, cutting seams that represented 6 weeks of labor. The next series showed her crouched beside a rented cargo van, hands beneath the chassis. The brake lines, I said. Celeste's vehicle was struck by a rental SUV traced to an account Priscilla controls. She sustained injuries requiring hospitalization. Rawlings set down the photographs and leaned back. His chair protested like ship's rigging under strain. You're describing attempted murder, Mr. Ashford, not fraud, not financial abuse. Attempted murder. I'm describing all 3. He studied me, and I recognized the calculation behind those measured eyes, weighing the political weight of the names, the resources required. Conviction likelihood versus headline certainty. I had spent 40 years reading men across negotiation tables, and I knew the exact moment Luther Rawlings decided this case was worth the cost. 48 hours, he said. Warrants require a judge who won't leak to defense counsel before ink dries. I know 2 who qualify. He tapped the folder. Sufficient for probable cause on financial charges and vehicular assault. The poisoning requires the original bottle tested by our lab, not a private physician's report. Catherine will coordinate the transfer tomorrow. Good. He stood and extended his hand. His grip carried the solidity of a man who finished what he started. One condition. Between now and Sunday, nothing changes in your household. No confrontations, no accusations, if either suspect knows what's coming. Evidence walks outdoors and across state lines. I understand. Do you? His gaze sharpened. In my experience, men in your position find patience the hardest part. I collected my coat and met his eyes. Detective. I spent 40 years waiting for cargo ships to cross oceans. I know how to choose the right moment. Evening air carried the particular weight of irreversible motion as I stepped onto the sidewalk. In 48 hours, warrants would be signed. In 72, lives would fracture along lines I had drawn. I drove home through streets gilded by late June light and found Lorraine in the kitchen, arranging sunflowers in the copper vase by the window. She looked up with the smile she had perfected over 7 years of practiced warmth. Marcus brought these over from the garden, she said, trimming a stem with kitchen shears. Aren't they lovely? They were my sunflowers. The ones I'd planted the spring after Helen died. And Lorraine was cutting their stems while arrest warrants waited for a judge's signature. Lorraine's sunflowers stayed with me the entire drive to Annapolis. My flowers, trimmed by her kitchen shears, arranged in my copper vase as if she had planted them herself. I let the image harden into fuel and followed the highway east toward the waterfront. I recognized her before she saw me. Nadine Holloway was Lorraine's older sister, a former fashion designer in her early 60s who had spent 2 decades living under her married name in this quiet harbor town. She had Lorraine's jawline but none of her hardness, and she sat in the corner booth of a clapboard cafe with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup like she was holding herself together. The morning light through salt-streaked windows caught threads of silver in her dark hair. And when she looked up, I saw the particular exhaustion of someone who had been bracing for a knock on the door for 20 years. Mr. Ashford. Not a question. She'd done her own research. I sat across from her. The cafe smelled of brine and warm bread and the faint diesel of boats idling at the marina. A bell above the door rang each time a fisherman entered, and each time Nadine's eyes flicked toward it. "Does she know you're here?" she asked. No. And she won't until it's too late for her to do anything about it. Something behind her eyes unlocked not trust, not yet, but the possibility of it. Good, because the last time someone told Lorraine I was talking, I lost everything I had left. I had come prepared with questions. Nadine made most of them unnecessary. She spoke the way survivors speak, without self-pity, without dramatic pauses, with the flat precision of someone who had rehearsed the truth in her own head for so long that every sentence arrived pre-edited. The court records Catherine had found told part of the story. Nadine told the rest. She didn't just take the money, Nadine said, turning her coffee cup in slow quarter rotations. She told our suppliers I was embezzling. She told our seamstresses I was using. None of it was true. But by the time I proved that, there was no business left to save. Listening to Nadine was like reading a rough draft of what was happening to Celeste, the same story. Written by the same hand, just 20 years earlier. The supplier manipulation, the whispered accusations, the systematic dismantling of reputation until the victim doubted her own reflection. "Why did you drop the lawsuit?" I asked, though I suspected the answer would be worse than the question. Nadine's hands stilled on the cup. She said if I didn't, she'd have me involuntarily committed. And she had a psychiatrist willing to sign the papers. The cafe noise continued. Forks on plates, the bell, a radio playing something nautical, but I heard none of it. I had prepared myself for financial cruelty, for manipulation, for the cold arithmetic of stolen assets. I had not prepared myself for this. A sister threatening to lock her own sister in a psychiatric facility with forged documentation. I believed her. Nadine continued. Because I'd watched her do things no reasonable person would do, and I knew she meant every word. So I dropped the case, changed my name back to my husband's, moved here, and spent 20 years making sure she never found a reason to follow through. I let the silence hold. Sometimes the most important thing a man can offer is the space to not be interrupted. 20 years hiding under a married name in a town 40 minutes away, that was what Lorraine's love looked like when you were her sister. She's doing it again, I said quietly. Nadine's cup stopped moving. Who? My daughter-in-law. The same playbook suppliers. Finances, reputation, and she poisoned me. The word landed between us like a stone in still water. Nadine's expression shifted, pain folding into something sharper, something with edges. I recognized it because I had felt it myself 8 days ago through frosted glass. Will you testify? I asked. At a family confrontation this Sunday, and in court afterward if it comes to that. Nadine did not hesitate, did not ask for time, for legal counsel, for assurances. She looked at me with the clear eyes of a woman who had carried a weight for 2 decades, and finally saw someone strong enough to help her set it down. I've waited 20 years for this call. We stood to leave. Nadine reached into her bag and pulled out a worn manila envelope, its corners softened by years of handling. I kept copies of everything. The forged supplier invoices, the psychiatrist's letter, the account transfers. I've carried this from apartment to apartment for 20 years, waiting for the day someone would need it. She placed it on the table between us. The envelope smelled faintly of cedar, the scent of closet shelves and patient, stubborn hope. Now someone does. I drove back from Annapolis with Nadine's envelope on the passenger seat, its cedar scent filling the car like a promise kept by someone else's patience. By the time I reached Georgetown, I had reorganized every assumption I carried into that cafe. Nadine was not a broken woman. She was a loaded weapon that had been waiting for a target. I knocked on Celeste's door at 7 the next morning with a briefcase full of evidence and a speech rehearsed on the drive over. But the moment she opened the door, she spoke first. I know why you're here, Dad. She stood in the doorway, wearing a paint-stained apron over yesterday's clothes, her eyes carrying the particular clarity of someone who had not slept because sleep would have been a waste of operational time. Garrison appeared behind her, his hand settling on her shoulder with a steadiness I had not seen from my son in months. I followed them to the kitchen table. I laid it all out. The toxicology confirmation, the security footage stills, the offshore transfer records, Nadine's envelope with its 20 years of preserved evidence. I arranged each document like cargo manifests on a shipping desk, systematic and complete. Celeste, I should have told you sooner. Your mother-in-law has been sabotaging my business, poisoning your tea, and trying to destroy me the same way she destroyed her own sister. Celeste's voice was level, not angry, not wounded, informed. I know. The kitchen smelled of cold coffee and fabric glue. Somewhere in the next room, a sewing machine sat mid-stitch, abandoned for a conversation that had been waiting months to happen. How long have you known? I asked. Celeste rose from the table and walked to her studio closet. She pulled a locked metal box from behind a false panel I would never have noticed, the kind of hiding place designed by someone who understood that the person searching would know exactly where amateurs kept their secrets. 7 months. She had been fighting this war alone for 7 months, while I thought I was the one protecting her. The box contained photographed emails from suppliers who had canceled without explanation, each one traced through metadata to a phone number registered under a name Lorraine used for personal errands. There were recorded conversations with Priscilla where careful questions had drawn her within a sentence of confessing. Bank statements Celeste had obtained through a forensic accountant showed unauthorized access patterns matching the same structured amounts Boyd had flagged. I started keeping records in November when the third supplier canceled, Celeste said. setting each item beside my documents, like matching puzzle pieces finding their other halves. I couldn't prove it was Lorraine then, but knew. The way she watched me at family dinners, not with dislike, but with assessment. Like she was measuring how much more I could take before I broke. Boyd arrived 20 minutes later. I had called him from the car. He stood over the combined evidence spread across the kitchen table, my investigation from the outside, Celeste's from the inside, and said what I was already thinking. You've got supplier interference documented from both ends. Her case file just doubled. Celeste looked at me with the quiet smile of a woman who had carried a secret not out of weakness, but out of strategy. We've been running the same operation from two ends. The taste of Garrison's bitter coffee lingered on my tongue as I watched my son process what his wife had endured in silence. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the moment he stopped being Lorraine's boy and became Celeste's husband. It happened in the space between one breath and the next. A shift so fundamental, it rearranged the geometry of his face. "She's my mother," Garrison said. His voice cracked on the word, then it steadied. "But Celeste is my wife. And my mother tried to kill her." The room held that sentence like a bell holds its last vibration. No one rushed to fill the silence. We planned the confrontation around the kitchen table, where Celeste had eaten family dinners for 7 years while documenting her own mother-in-law's campaign to destroy her. The collection launch Celeste's boutique reopening would be the stage. Lorraine and Priscilla would both attend, expecting a celebration they could quietly sabotage. Instead, they would walk into the combined weight of 2 investigations and a detective with signed warrants. "I'm not hiding anymore," Celeste said. "I want her to see my face when it all comes down." "Then the collection launch is where we end this," I said. As we finalized the details, Celeste's phone buzzed against the table. She read the screen, and the color left her face in a single tide. Lorraine just moved the collection launch up by 3 days. Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's tomorrow night." The kitchen went silent. Everything we had planned for Sunday had just been compressed into 24 hours. 24 hours. We made every one of them count. Catherine fast-tracked the warrant paperwork. Rawlings confirmed his team would be in position, and Nadine drove up from Annapolis that afternoon. By the time evening arrived, every piece was set. The Ritz-Carlton Georgetown ballroom was full 200 guests. Champagne on silver trays. Celeste's gowns on lit pedestals glowing under recessed lights. The air carried perfume and anticipation, and the faint sweetness of sugared hors d'oeuvres. And Lorraine walked to the microphone like she owned the room. Because in 15 seconds, she planned to burn it down. She wore ivory. Of course she did. The color of innocence, chosen with the precision of a woman who had spent decades weaponizing appearances. She gripped the microphone stand and smiled at the audience with the warmth she reserved for performances. "I hate to do this publicly," she began, her voice carrying the rehearsed reluctance of someone who had practiced this speech in a mirror. "But the truth matters. This gown." She lifted the VIP couture piece from its pedestal with one hand. Was supposed to represent excellence. And instead, she pulled a seam, and the stitching parted with an audible tear. It falls apart in my hands. On cue, Priscilla rose from the 3rd row. "I ordered a custom piece from this boutique and it arrived damaged. This is a pattern of incompetence," the murmur began. 200 guests shifting in their chairs, exchanging glances, some already reaching for phones. I stood near the back wall beside Boyd, who had a laptop balanced on one arm and a wireless connection to the ballroom's projection system. Celeste waited near the far exit, exactly where she had planned to be, not fleeing, but positioned. I walked to the stage. "You want to know what justice looks like? It looks like a ballroom full of people watching a woman's mask fall off in real time." "Lorraine, you're absolutely right," I said. taking the microphone from its stand with the calm of a man who had loaded every chamber before entering the room. The truth matters. So let's show everyone the truth. Boyd pressed a key. The ballroom screens, 4 of them, mounted for the fashion showcase, flickered and filled with security footage. Priscilla, time-stamped 2 nights ago. Inside Celeste's workshop at 11 in the evening, scissors in hand, cutting the exact seams Lorraine had just torn open for the audience. The footage was sharp. The face was unmistakable. The murmur died. The ballroom became a held breath. "This footage shows your associate cutting those seams herself," I said. "This toxicology report shows what was being administered through my evening routine. And this document," I held up the ownership transfer, "shows that I hold 65% of the boutique you just tried to destroy." Lorraine's smile did not fall. It froze, preserved on her face like a photograph of a woman who no longer existed. Her mouth opened. "You don't know what you're—" "I know exactly what I'm doing." A movement at the back of the room. The crowd parted, and Nadine walked through them with the unhurried pace of someone who had rehearsed this walk for 20 years, inside her own head. She stopped 5 feet from the stage. Lorraine hadn't seen her sister in 2 decades, and the look on her face said she had spent every one of those years believing she never would again. "Hello, Lorraine." Nadine's voice was steady as harbor stone. "It's been 20 years. I kept the receipts." The color left Lorraine's face the way tide leaves sand. Completely. Irreversibly. She gripped the podium. "She's lying. She was always unstable. She built a case from the inside for 7 months," I said, gesturing toward Celeste. "Your sister kept evidence for 20 years, and your son has something to say." Garrison stepped forward from the second row. He stood beside Celeste, took her hand, and looked at his mother with the expression of a man setting down a weight he had carried since childhood. "It's over, Mom." The taste of champagne lingered in the room, untouched on every table. Lorraine's eyes swept the ballroom, searching for an ally, a sympathizer, an exit. Every face she found had already turned. She spun toward the ballroom doors. Rawlings was already there, badge out. 2 uniformed officers flanking him, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe with the patience I remembered from his office. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Lorraine Ashford. Priscilla Vance, you're both under arrest." The champagne glasses on the nearest table caught the chandelier light. Every one of them was still full. Nobody was drinking anymore. Priscilla didn't wait for the handcuffs. She kicked off her heels and ran for the kitchen corridor, shoving a waiter sideways. Champagne flutes shattered across the marble floor, the sound cutting through the ballroom's stunned silence like a starting pistol fired in a cathedral. I didn't move. I didn't need to. Boyd was already positioned at the loading dock exit. We had mapped every corridor in the building that afternoon. 2 of Rawlings' officers intercepted Priscilla in the kitchen. Through the service doors, I heard trays crashing and her voice rising. "I was just following orders." Her voice cracked against the tile walls. "She made me do all of it." "You can explain that at the station," Rawlings said from the ballroom doorway, his tone carrying the flat professionalism of a man who had heard better excuses from worse criminals. "Hands behind your back." Back in the ballroom. Lorraine stood motionless at the podium where I had left her. She did not resist when the second officer approached. She did not plead. Her eyes swept the room with the methodical precision of a woman cataloging every face that had just watched her empire collapse, storing names, measuring debts, calculating who might still be useful from inside a holding cell. "You'll regret this," she said to me. Not shouting, quiet. The voice of someone who still believed she held cards no one had seen. Lorraine walked out of the Ritz-Carlton the same way she had walked in, chin raised, back straight, heels striking marble with metronomic composure. Except this time, there were handcuffs where the diamond bracelet used to be. The ballroom doors closed behind her. 200 guests exhaled at once. Then Sheldon Kirkland materialized from the crowd like a man stepping out of his own shadow. The estate attorney Lorraine had turned was a thin man in his 40s with the look of someone who had been losing sleep for months and had just decided which side of the law he wanted to land on. His skin was the color of old paper and his hands trembled as he pulled Boyd aside near the coat check station. I recorded everything. He pressed a USB drive into Boyd's palm with the urgency of a man discarding a grenade. Every call, every instruction. She told me exactly how to structure the transfers. I'll testify to all of it. Boyd turned the drive over in his fingers. Why now? Sheldon's laugh was thin enough to cut glass. Because I just watched the smartest woman I know get arrested in front of 200 people. And I'd rather be a witness than a co-defendant. Boyd pocketed the drive and handed him Catherine's card. She'll be in touch tomorrow. Don't leave the district. I watched Sheldon disappear into the thinning crowd. His shoulders drawn up around his ears like a man walking through rain that only he could feel. His recordings would seal the prosecution. Lorraine's own voice, instructing her own advisor, preserved in digital amber by a man whose loyalty had an expiration date. The ballroom was half empty now. Waitstaff had begun clearing untouched plates. The gowns still glowed on their pedestals, beautiful and undamaged, all except the one Lorraine had torn, which lay across the stage like evidence at a crime scene. Which, I supposed, it was. I had spent 11 days tearing my family apart to save it. Standing near that stage, watching the last guests file out in quiet clusters, I finally knew it was worth every sleepless night. I returned to the microphone. The sound system was still live, and my voice carried across the remaining guests with a clarity I had not planned, but did not waste. This woman built something beautiful, I said, extending my hand toward Celeste. She walked to the stage with the measured grace of someone who had earned every step. Someone tried to tear it apart. That ends tonight. Celeste Ashford is the future of this family, and this boutique belongs to her. Fully and permanently. I put my arm around her shoulders. She was trembling not with fear, but with the particular vibration of sustained strength finally allowed to rest. "Thank you, Dad," she said, her voice catching on the word, "for everything you did, that I didn't know about, and everything I did that you didn't know about." Garrison stood in the front row. He was the first to applaud. The sound of his hands meeting was the loneliest, bravest thing I had ever heard my son do. Later that night, I sat alone in the Alexandria study that still carried traces of Lorraine's perfume. My phone rang. Catherine. The offshore account, we froze it in time. But there's something else. A second trust, opened 6 years ago, with Garrison's name on it. She paused. Lorraine was siphoning from your son, too. Catherine's revelation sat with me through the night. 6 years. Lorraine had opened a trust in our son's name and drained it like a second well, siphoning from the boy she claimed to love while smiling across the dinner table. I told Garrison the next morning. He took it the way soldiers take shrapnel, absorbing the impact, then moving forward. The boutique looked different in morning light without a crime hanging over it. Just fabric and thread, and the quiet hum of a sewing machine Celeste had already turned back on. As if the work itself was her way of declaring survival. The air smelled of fresh linen, and the faint sweetness of the tea she now brewed herself. From leaves she chose and water she boiled. We gathered in the back office, Garrison. Celeste, and I with Catherine's documents spread across a cutting table still marked with chalk lines from the last collection. The paperwork was simple. Ownership of the boutique transferred to Celeste in its entirety. The estate share divided equally between Garrison and Celeste, effective immediately. This boutique is yours, I said, signing the first page. Entirely, legally, permanently. No investor, no silent partner, no one who can touch it. Garrison picked up the pen before I finished speaking. And the trust she opened in my name, close it. I don't want a cent she moved. He signed with the decisive strokes of a man severing a cord he should have cut years ago. Celeste watched him, and I saw her hand find his beneath the table, not in comfort, but in solidarity. The touch of two people who had both been targets and had chosen each other over the person who aimed at them. You gave me back more than a business, Dad, Celeste said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were not. You gave me back my belief that someone was watching. How do you mourn someone who is still alive, but was never the person you thought they were? I asked myself that question as I drove alone to the detention facility that afternoon, telling no one where I was going. The answer, I was learning, is that you mourn them the way you mourn a country you emigrated from slowly, in private. No, you can never go back because the place you remember never existed. The DC detention center smelled of industrial disinfectant and recycled air. I checked in at the front desk, surrendered my phone and belt, and followed a corridor of fluorescent light to the visitation wing. The guard who escorted me had the practiced neutrality of someone who had watched 1,000 marriages end through reinforced glass. I stopped outside the partition. Lorraine sat on the other side in an orange jumpsuit, her hair undone for the first time I could remember. In 7 years of marriage, I had never seen her without her hair arranged, pinned, curled, lacquered into whatever shape the occasion required. Without it, she looked smaller, older, almost like someone I might have pitied if I hadn't read the toxicology report. She pressed her hand against the glass. The gesture was precise, palm flat, fingers spread, the way people touch partitions in movies about wrongful convictions. But this conviction was not wrong, and my hand stayed at my side. The longest distance between two people is the width of a glass partition when one of them knows the truth and the other knows they know. I did not sit down. I did not pick up the phone. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, looking at the woman I had married. The woman who had poured sedatives into my evening wine while asking about my day, who had arranged my sunflowers while orchestrating my cognitive decline. I looked until I had memorized her, without the armor, and then I turned to leave. The sound of the phone lifting on her side stopped me. Her voice came through the glass, muffled but clear enough. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I stood with my back to her. That was the most honest thing she had said in 7 years. And the cruelest, because it meant she had known exactly what she was doing from the start. She just hadn't planned on getting caught. The difference between regret and miscalculation is invisible to everyone except the person standing on the other side of the glass. I walked out without turning around. I was almost to my car when a guard jogged across the parking lot. "Mr. Ashford, your wife asked me to give you this." He handed me a folded piece of paper. I opened it under a sky the color of old pewter. One line, in Lorraine's handwriting. The letters small and controlled even now. Ask Sheldon about the house in Bethesda. It's not in my name. I called Sheldon about the Bethesda house the morning after the detention visit. He confirmed the property existed, confirmed he had set up the shell company, and confirmed he would testify to all of it. Then his voice dropped, and he said something I had not expected. The house was occupied. Catherine took over from there, but what mattered first was the courtroom. The months that followed blurred into plea negotiations, discovery motions, and a trial date that finally arrived at the end of the year. Courtroom 4B was smaller than I expected. The kind of room where a marriage ends in 45 minutes of legal language and a judge who has already read the file. It smelled of wood polish and old carpet and the bitter institutional coffee someone had spilled near the gallery entrance. Celeste sat beside me in the second row, her hands folded in her lap with the disciplined stillness of a woman who had trained herself not to react in public. Priscilla's case was heard first. She entered through a side door in a gray suit her attorney had clearly chosen, her eyes fixed on the defense table as if the wood grain held instructions. Judge Harold Whitfield was a silver-haired federal judge in his late 60s, with a measured voice and the kind of stillness that made defendants realize the room had been already decided before they spoke. Her attorney argued coercion, a vulnerable woman, manipulated by a dominant personality into actions she would never have chosen independently. The judge listened with the patience of a man who had heard the same defense 1,000 times and believed it approximately never. Ms. Vance, the evidence shows you acted with deliberation, not duress, Judge Whitfield said, his voice carrying the weight of a sentence already calculated. Tampering with a vehicle's braking system constitutes intent to cause serious bodily harm. 4 years, federal custody, full restitution to the victim, permanent restraining order. Priscilla did not look at anyone. But as the officers approached, she leaned toward her attorney, and her whisper carried farther than she intended. She promised me nothing would happen. She promised. You would think watching your wife get sentenced would feel like victory. It does not. It feels like attending a funeral for someone who was never real. Lorraine entered in a navy suit, not the orange jumpsuit from the detention center, but something Catherine had arranged. Because even the justice system permits a certain choreography. Her hair was pinned again, her posture restored to the architecture I had known for 7 years. She stood at the defense table and faced Judge Whitfield the way she had faced every room she had ever entered, as if she were the most important person in it. The judge recited the charges without inflection. Criminal poisoning, elder financial abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud. He referenced the pattern testimony, a sister's account spanning 2 decades, a financial advisor's recordings, security footage, toxicology reports. The evidence formed a timeline that stretched from a destroyed fashion label to a hospital bed, connected by the same hands and the same methodology. Mrs. Ashford, what makes this case particularly egregious is the pattern, Judge Whitfield said. A pattern you refined over 2 decades and deployed against members of your own family. 6 years, 3 served, 3 supervised release. Lorraine received the sentence the way a cliff receives a wave without visible movement, absorbing it into stone. But I saw her hand grip the table edge until her knuckles whitened, and I knew the performance was costing her everything she had left. She turned as the officers approached, and her eyes found mine across the courtroom. "You could have come to me first," she said. "You chose a stage instead." She was still performing, even now with the gavel's echo fading into the ventilation hum. She was rewriting the story to cast herself as the wronged party. Some people cannot stop acting because they have forgotten there was ever a self beneath the role. The officers led her out. The courtroom door closed with the soft click of a chapter ending. Celeste took my arm on the courthouse steps, and it was such a small gesture. But it was the first time in this entire ordeal that someone held on to me, instead of the other way around. The June sun hit the limestone facade and turned it the color of warm bone. We walked a full block in silence, tasting the clean air after hours of recycled courtroom atmosphere. "The note she passed you," Celeste said finally. "The Bethesda house. Did Catherine find anything?" "She's looking into it. But today isn't about Lorraine's last secrets. Today is about closing the door on what she did." "Then let's close it." We kept walking. That evening, Catherine called. The Bethesda house was real, purchased 7 years ago through Sheldon's shell company. But it was not empty. Someone had been living there, paying utilities under a name Catherine recognized from the velour file. Lorraine's note was not a confession. It was a final move in a game I did not yet understand. The name Catherine, recognized from the velour file, belonged to Ramona Blackwell, the same woman who had lunched with Priscilla 3 weeks before this began. The same investor whose quiet interference had opened doors for Lorraine inside the boutique. The Bethesda house had been Lorraine's staging ground for the entire operation. Catherine's records showed Ramona had lived there rent-free for 2 years, paying only the utilities, in exchange for laundering a portion of the boutique's investor funds back to Lorraine, through inflated consulting invoices. It was never a love nest or a hideout. It was a second set of books, hidden in a house that existed on no document bearing my wife's name. But before I could deal with that property, I needed to deal with the woman who had helped run it. There were 3 loose ends left from the wreckage Lorraine built, and I intended to tie every one before the week was out. Ramona arrived at the boutique on a Tuesday morning, expecting a meeting about restructured investment terms. She was a boutique investor in her late 40s, who had facilitated Lorraine's interference while maintaining the polished smile of someone who believed accountability was for other people. She sat in Celeste's back office with her legs crossed and a leather portfolio on her lap, radiating the particular confidence of a woman who had not yet been told the ground beneath her had been sold. Celeste laid the emails on the table. Supplier changes Ramona had approved without authorization. Client complaint logs routed directly to Lorraine's phone. Schedule adjustments that gave Priscilla access to the workshop after hours. I didn't know what Lorraine was planning, Ramona said, her smile thinning at the edges. I just did what any investor would do to protect her. You forwarded my client list to a woman who was poisoning my father-in-law, Celeste said. Her voice carried no anger. It carried something worse. Certainty. You knew exactly what you were doing. You just didn't think I'd find out. Ramona's portfolio shifted in her lap. My shares give me a voice in this business, and I intend to... Your shares were purchased 3 weeks ago, I said. You have no stake here. This is a courtesy, not a negotiation. The silence that followed tasted like cold metal. Ramona looked from me to Celeste to the exit agreement Catherine had prepared. A single page, already notarized, requiring only her signature to formalize what was already done. She signed without another word and walked out carrying nothing but her portfolio and the particular posture of someone who had just learned the difference between leverage and the illusion of it. Watching Ramona leave was like pulling the last splinter from a wound small. Necessary, and the relief was sharper than the pain. The second loose end arrived an hour later. Marisol Reyes was Celeste's 26-year-old studio assistant, a talented seamstress with dark curls pinned behind her ears and hands that smelled of fabric starch. She walked into the boutique expecting to be fired. Lorraine had told her she would be blamed for everything if the scheme unraveled. Instead, Celeste handed her a letter of reinstatement. She said if I didn't share your schedule, she'd make sure I never worked in fashion again, Marisol said, her voice breaking on the last word. The sound of her guilt filled the room like humidity. I should have come to you. You were scared, Celeste said. I understand scared. I've been living it for a year. You're not fired. You're family. Marisol pressed her hands to her face and wept with the particular abandon of someone who had been holding a secret so long that releasing it felt like losing a limb. Celeste put her arms around her. I stepped into the corridor and gave them the room. Because some kinds of forgiveness require privacy. The third loose end was not a person, but a name. The following week, workers arrived with ladders and a new sign. Celeste had chosen to rename the boutique. Not a rebrand, not a marketing strategy, but a declaration. The old signage came down in sections, each letter removed with a drill and a quiet pop that echoed across the Georgetown sidewalk. Celeste and I stood watching from across the street, coffee cups warm in our hands. The July air carrying the scent of fresh paint and cut grass from the adjacent courtyard. The new letters went up one at a time. Her name. Just her name. Marisol turned the sign in the window to read open, and the morning sunlight caught the new gold lettering. For the first time in months, I watched Celeste smile without looking over her shoulder first. No more investors, she said quietly. No more silent partners. Just my name on the door and my work inside it. That's all it ever should have been. That night, locking up the Alexandria house, I found a package on the front porch. No return address, no postmark, hand-delivered. Inside was a framed photograph of 2 young women in a design studio, arms around each other. laughing with the unguarded joy of people who had not yet learned to hurt each other. On the back, in handwriting I did not recognize. She wasn't always like this. Thank you for remembering that. It was signed with a single letter N. I placed Nadine's photograph on the shelf in my study that night. Beside the maritime clock Helen had given me the year before she died. 2 women from 2 lifetimes, both framed. Both reminding me that love is not a fixed thing, it moves, it changes shape. And sometimes, it becomes something you have to survive, rather than something that sustains you. The laughing girl in that photograph had become the woman behind the glass. I could hold both truths without needing to reconcile them. The morning I walked into Celeste's boutique for the last time as a man with something to fix. I carried sunflowers, the same variety I had bought the day all of this started. Tall, heavy-headed, the color of something that refuses to stop reaching toward the light. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, and the air smelled of fresh linen and the cedar sachets Marisol had placed in every drawer during the restock. I saw them immediately, on Celeste's desk. Beside her sketch pad and a cold cup of chamomile tea stood the dried birthday bouquet, the sunflowers I had left at her door on that first terrible day. She had preserved them. The petals had darkened to the amber of old honey, the stems gone rigid, but they were upright and intact inside a clear glass vase. I set the fresh bouquet beside them. 2 arrangements side by side, one brittle from surviving everything, one just beginning. Celeste looked up from her cutting table. I kept the first ones, she said. I dried them the day you left them at my door, before I even knew what you were doing for me. Why did you keep them? Because they were the first sign that someone in this family was paying attention. If you have stayed with me this long, you already know the hardest part of this story was not uncovering the lies. It was accepting how long I had chosen not to see them. Nadine sat at the far end of the cutting table with fabric swatches spread before her and a sketch pad angled toward the window light. She held a pencil the way musicians hold instruments, with the unconscious authority of a skill that lives in the hands, not the head. 20 years away from fashion, and her fingers still knew where a seam should fall, where a hemline wanted to break, where fabric needed room to breathe. I watched them work together, Celeste pinning a muslin prototype to the dress form, while Nadine sketched modifications in the margins of a pattern sheet. 2 women Lorraine had tried to destroy, sitting 3 feet apart, building something new in the same room where the old thing had been torn down. She has better instincts than I ever did, Nadine said without looking up from her sketch. Lorraine knew that. That's why she was afraid of her. Celeste smiled. You're the one who taught yourself to design again after losing everything. That's not instinct. That's stubborn. Must run in the family we chose, Nadine said. Not the one we were given. The sound of their laughter filled the boutique the way water fills a vessel naturally. Completely. Without needing to be forced. It was the sound of 2 women who had earned the right to find things funny again. 2 bouquets on one desk. One dried and brittle from surviving the storm, one fresh and just beginning. That is what family looks like after you rebuild it. The scars and the new growth, side by side, neither one pretending the other does not exist. I stepped outside onto the Georgetown sidewalk. Through the boutique window, I could see Celeste holding up a swatch of midnight blue, while Nadine nodded and pointed to something on her sketch. The new sign caught the afternoon light. Celeste's name in gold lettering, clean and unshared. The taste of summer air carried coffee from the shop next door, and the warm stone smell of old Georgetown brick baking in the July sun. I had spent 7 years trusting the wrong woman, and 11 days learning to trust the right ones. The difference between trust and blind faith is simple. Trust survives the truth. Blind faith requires you never to look. I had stopped looking for so long that when I finally opened my eyes, the damage filled every room in my house. But looked. And because I looked, Celeste kept her boutique, Nadine reclaimed her craft, Garrison chose his wife, and a family that should have been destroyed found a way to stand. My phone buzzed as I reached the corner. A photograph from Celeste, the boutique window shot from inside, the new sign catching the light, the 2 bouquets on her desk. And in the glass reflection, barely visible, an old man walking away, who finally looked like he knew where he was going. And to you listening to my story, remember this. I spent 7 years pouring wine with the woman who was poisoning it. I trusted without questioning, loved without looking, and called it devotion when it was really just blindness. Don't make my mistake. Don't confuse comfort with safety. The people who smile the widest at your dinner table are sometimes the ones rearranging the chairs while you sleep. This was never meant to be a revenge story, though I understand if it sounds like one. What started as a revenge story became something else entirely when I realized that revenge doesn't rebuild what was broken. Only truth does. I believe God placed every person in this story exactly where they needed to be. Nadine waiting in Annapolis for 20 years. Celeste quietly building her case from the inside. Even Lorraine showing me what blind faith costs when you refuse to open your eyes. The real lesson is simple. Trust the people who earn it, protect the ones who deserve it, and never be too proud to admit you were wrong about someone you loved. That is not a revenge story. That is a survival story. If this story moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me what you would have done differently. Would you have confronted her sooner, or waited like I did? Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss a story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Just a reminder, certain names, locations, and details in this story have been adjusted for privacy and storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is purely coincidental. The heart of the message is what I hope stays with you. God bless you.